welcome back to another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. I'm your humble host, Blake, and this is the Good Advice Podcast. You're checking out, in my opinion, the best resource for how to grow and scale your business. There's no fluff in this podcast. It's just good advice. And there's really nothing in here that is going to, I don't know if I'm underselling the show at this point, but there's really nothing in here that's going to blow your mind. But if you've been in business a long time, you know it's really not the big complicated stuff that makes business hard. It's the simple stuff. It's doing the simple things that time and again can either make or break your business. We're going to be talking about all of that on the podcast, not just today, but in future episodes as well. By the way, we're coming up on 5 years of the Good Advice Podcast. So make sure you're paying attention in this upcoming month. We're going to be spotlighting some of our all-time best episodes. I'm very excited to share a bit about the podcast. In fact, if you've been part of the podcast journey with me, I want to tell you thank you. Seriously, thank you for tuning into the podcast week after week, for listening to the show, however long you've been listening. We're coming up on 400 episodes. Goodness gracious. So thanks for being part of the journey. Don't forget, if you're enjoying the podcast, you can leave us a Google review. Just look up Good Advice here in Northwest Arkansas and drop a little review saying you enjoy the podcast. And also don't forget, we do have a Patreon. It's at patreon.com/goodadvice. The price of a cup of coffee, just $5. You can support the podcast so we can keep bringing good advice to everybody who's listening. So all that to say, I'm very excited for today's episode. We have the great Stephen J. Blank, who's joining the podcast. Stephen is a book author. He just published his latest book, Your Turning Point, 33 Questions for Transformation. If you've been in this journey a long time, you know that there's quite a bit that goes into really understanding yourself, understanding what you bring to the table, and hey, these are key parts to running a business. Stephen is also a business owner himself. He's a successful entrepreneur. We're going to be talking about that today. But if you want to find out more, you can go to the33questions.com. Before we dive into this conversation with Stephen, absolutely, I want to tell you about one of the amazing businesses that continue to sponsor the podcast. Take a listen very quickly. We'll be right back shortly. Talk soon. Hey, have you been thinking about your health insurance plan for this next year? Maybe you just jumped into the world of entrepreneurship and you're thinking, geez, is it possible to have a good insurance plan if I'm no longer working for a business? Maybe you're even running a business and you're thinking about what does it look like to have an affordable group plan for your employees? Well, I want to tell you about Optimum Health Insurance. This is a customized healthcare plan for you and your family. And since 2018, they've been helping people get awesome, affordable healthcare coverage for really nothing at all. It's easy, it's hassle-free, and frankly, they're different from the big insurance companies that you might talk to. And crazy enough, you might even be paying less than what you've paid at a previous job when you were on some company health insurance plan. If you want to find out more and save money on your health insurance, you absolutely need to go check out OptimumHealthInsurancePlan.com. That's OptimumHealthInsurancePlan.com. That's today's sponsor. Enjoy this episode. It is so good, Steve, to have you on the podcast today. I'm excited to dive in and talk about your book, 33 Questions for Transformation. I'm also excited to you got a couple of decades or more of some sales experience with your drivertrainingtools.com business. Excited to get a little bit of sales insight from you. You'll learn a little bit from you, but first things first, how are you doing today?
Oh, terrific. This is a unique opportunity. I'm really glad to be on your show.
Yeah, and you came to us. It's funny, you and I, for our listeners, we had, actually, let me pull up the episode numbers here before I forget. But Steve and I were chatting a bit before, and of course I can't find Paul's episode now, but we were chatting about Paul, who introduced you to me, and Paul has been on the podcast before. Right. And that's one of my favorite things, by the way, is when I have a terrific guest who comes on the show and they're like, all right, well, if you like me, you really got to meet this person. So it was great getting you on. But you and I also found out a mutual connection, someone who's been on the show 3+ years ago, almost 4 years ago, right? John Molyneux, who was on the podcast, The Sales Samurai. So it's kind of funny how, it's kind of like the joke, 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon, how like everyone, you're only so many steps from the next person.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of wild to me that you and I have a couple other connections that I just didn't expect. We're in totally different states, but anyway, that's my ramblings for the intro to the show. But tell me a little bit for our listeners, a little bit about yourself. What are you doing? A little bit of an overview of the book, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Much like we talked about in the beginning, the warm-up call, where you spent most of your time, if not a great deal or all of your having grown up in Arkansas. I've grown up in northern Baltimore County, which is like the small suburb outside. Baltimore County is the largest of all 23 counties in Maryland. And I went to school locally, graduated from Ithaca College in a degree involving doing everything except knowing exactly what I was going to do.
And what was this degree?
Oh, it would be in English and communication.
Okay, I was going to ask if it was communications.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
And I just love working with people, always have. And in my high school, I was a rec leader working with young people. And now my business is hiring young people to help in my business. I had lost my job in running a driving school of all things because I taught driver education at my local high school and coached. And a lot of people in the field who actually make very good money have an accreditation to teach driving in Maryland or Virginia, especially in Illinois, which requires driver's ed in every high school. They can make well over $50,000 up to $80,000 a year combining those things. So I found this niche business, which is supplies to driving schools across the country. We have 3,000 customers now. And I've just been so fortunate to be in something called driver's ed supplies for vehicles, mainly across the country.
You know what I love about this too? There's the expression niches make riches. I was pronouncing it wrong, or the way I pronounce it. Then all of a sudden I realized that the rhyme didn't work. But niches make riches. And I love conversations like this, Steve, because sometimes it's like, I think when people think about entrepreneurship, they think about like these really kind of grandiose ideas.
Right.
You centered in on an industry that you understood with a niche that you knew how to provide for, and you've done very well for yourself. Have you thought much about kind of this process of getting to this point, and I guess your journey through entrepreneurship in general at all?
Quite a bit, actually, and that's part of the subject of the book. And I really thought, as you mentioned, how did this happen? And I just kept trying things. And what I've learned about successful businesses, to segue, if you will, to tie into successful businesses, that being the bulk of your audience, and I'm a business person first and foremost, but that finding something and continuing, to, I call it flipping levers, right? Until you find that thing. And so I would be teaching people driving or running a driving school, and I'd be speaking with people about what they're doing. One of the great quotes I ever had in my life, and you might like this one as well, came from a guy that ran a trash and recycling business. And he said, I don't do anything in my life without knowing why I'm doing it first. And it hit me hard. I was like, oh, wow. I was in my early 30s then, and I'm about 60 now. At least I'm trying to stop the clock, but they're still it's still in the game.
Keeps going, right?
But and I really, kept going, and having played sports and went into college and played sports, and I realized that I wasn't the biggest, the best, or the fastest, or the most athletic, but I always kept at it. And I think that is part of what happened here. And I found something that worked after trying many different things. And I would never criticize anybody who tried 30 or 40 or 20 or 12 different things. And a career trajectory is not a straight arrow, right?
Yeah,
you might agree.
I 100% agree. And I love that insight too, because one of the things we talk about on the podcast is sort of like the shame that many business owners experience in not getting it immediately, like it not working the first time.
That's right.
And I think social media has really frame this in a negative way of, people post success stories and it was so easy and it just happened. And,
right.
And then I hear a perspective like yours that talks about, hey, if you try 12 times, that's okay. If it takes 20 or 30 times, that's okay. And I especially loved your insight that, the career path isn't a straight arrow, because it almost feels like when it's not straight, we feel guilty, like, what's wrong with me? Like, what am I doing wrong? Rather than appreciating, this is the path. So,
yeah, I totally agree. And you mentioned a very key word that's in the book. I like to think about the book as if you're going to a movie like people might have heard of the Draft movie, the 2014 Kevin Costner. I don't know if that's familiar to you, Blake, but it was about the 2014 draft. And so Kevin Costner's in it. Well, he's in the movie, because he's the guy who does the clever thing to get the biggest trade at the right time in the draft, the NFL draft. But he can't really do it all without Jennifer Garner. And if people seen Jennifer Garner, she's a very beautiful actress. And she's in the movie so that when the husband goes to the movie or with the boyfriend and girlfriend, that there's something there, for the other partner. Kevin Costner's there for the man, right? He's the guy, the macho guy, slugging it out, making it happen. And I think about the book as being for two audiences like that, right? That the book is about transformation for those people that are facing challenges and wondering, I'm here and I'm looking at it. I'm like, I don't really like here. How do I get there? You know what I'm saying? And not being ashamed. And you mentioned that critical word, not being ashamed, but being in the moment and saying, hey, wait a minute. Okay. I've got self-awareness. That's my first chapter. I'm aware that this is where I am. I own it, right? It's mine. It's not Oscar's, right? It's not Peter's. It's not Mary's. It's mine.
Yeah.
And I'm going to wear it. And I don't feel ashamed about it. And I'm going to build from here. Yeah. So the two audiences come into play because it's for that person on a personal mind, body, spirit level. But it's also about business because real businesses fail on purpose so they can improve.
So I want to expand on that a bit. And for our listeners, we talked about it in the introduction to the podcast. We're talking with Steve Blank, in his book, Your Turning Point, 33 Questions for Transformation. This is available on the33questions.com, which is going to be in our episode description. Steve, I think another layer of this, we're talking about like sort of that personal, not just, I think mindset's maybe too superficial a word because people throw mindset out a lot. I think it's an accurate term, but I don't know if it really hits on the personal diligence we have to go through to like keep ourselves focused. There's this other piece of it too, this sort of like resilience piece against other people's criticism. And a couple of examples for you. I have a friend of mine who runs a business that sells journals, and he does really well. The business is amazing, but he's told a story of like a family member being like, "Oh, are you still doing that like paper thing? That you were doing like paper something?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's a real business. It is something." And not just like things that are like kind of condescending like that, but I get a lot of questions from people who aren't entrepreneurs who are just like,
Mhm.
So like, what, like, you enjoy this? Like, what do you do? Like, so what's your advice for people listening who they understand the importance of like being personally committed, giving yourself grace, not being too hard on yourself,
Right.
but also staying committed despite a lot of external voices, especially sometimes people close to them. Any advice for those people to sort of stay the path and experiment and learn and maybe even embrace failure?
Yeah, I feel like all of that is correct. The number one rule I have is just keep going, right? Flipping levers,
Mm-hmm.
and believing in yourself. I had the advantage of having been successful in financial services right out of college. It was my first job, and I went from 300 a week to 1,000 or 1,200 a week, right? So when I took a setback, I had that advantage, and I could reach, into that vault, if you will, of success. So I would say that if you don't, maybe that hasn't happened for you, maybe, but there is something that makes you feel your strongest, right? And you're at your most purposeful, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you the most joy. That's what I would hold on to, and
Mm. Yeah.
realize your own worth and go from there.
Yeah. No, and I like that piece of advice too, of really honing in on what you find enjoyable or what fulfills you. I'll also say that I feel like a lot of professionals don't know what that thing is. And I do think you see it sometimes in the entrepreneurial world where someone tries like one business and then like 6 months later they're doing an entirely different business, or they're hopping around to a lot of different ideas,
Right. Yeah.
which isn't necessarily bad, by the way, for our listeners. I'm not,
Right.
if you are exploring, I don't want to give you a hard time, but it does feel like professionals, and I'm a younger guy, I'm 35. I know a
Mhm.
lot of people in my generation who they're going to the 9 to 5 job, but they don't even really know what fulfills them.
Right.
Do you feel like this is a certain generation thing, or do you feel like all professionals kind of have to figure this out?
It's kind of like a combination would be my reflexive answer, right? I'd have to think more over time to get more complex answer, but it does tie into what's going on, and I think I feel like what you're saying, it applies to both sets. I'm not one of those people that say, look at that group, the Gen Q, right? Or, how about those, what do they call them? They call us what are the 60s
Boomers.
people? The boomers.
Yeah.
Hey, boomer, right?
Okay, boomer. Yeah.
I mean, I was on the periphery of that. I remember black and white television when Kennedy got shot. One of my first memories was the horseless carriage going around Washington. It's a very so it really applies to both. I would address that quiet quitting is going on today, and you're probably familiar, right? Where
Yeah. We've
that's
talked
been in
about
the
it
press
on
a
the
lot.
show. Yeah.
Oh, you had a show about it?
We've talked about it on the show, and we've
Oh,
posted some
great.
content around
Oh,
it.
great.
Yeah. And
Uh,
apologize for interrupting.
yeah,
For
sure.
our listeners, what Steve's talking about, quiet quitting, we're referring to employees who aren't literally quitting, but they are deciding to do the bare minimum, essentially completely disengaging from their work.
Right.
So quitting in all regards except for actually quitting is the best way to think
Right.
about it.
And then getting to a point, I think I was reading one, Understandably, which is a terrific thing that I get. It's like a newsletter, and the guy sends out all kinds of different ideas. And uh, he was talking about somebody interviewed, right? And he said he did less and less and less until. So I think it's a generational thing that that instead of really confronting it, you quiet quit, maybe, right? Where it becomes the diminution of your work effort, excuse me, and your work product happens to such an extent, right? That eventually the light in the candle just goes out, right?
Yeah.
And I'm against that for a couple reasons. Number one, that one of the things that I had to do in my own life was to confront and vanquish my past, right? The philosophers will tell you that your past does not exist, especially if it's going to be a hindrance.
Yeah.
So every day I wake up and I say, I'm going to have either a good day or a great day. Period. End of sentence. And I'm so fortunate, Blake, that I found something to work on the internet as an internet entrepreneur. I will not meet 97.5% of my customers, right? They say, I want to come to your showroom. And I was like, well, it's kind of more like a clubhouse, with pictures of all the places, New Orleans and Washington State and Texas, meeting driver ed professionals across the country. It's like that confronting, I'm really more about saying, okay, listen, what is going on here, right? And how do I deal with it? And I'm sure even with a small difference in our age of at least 2 decades that you found that yourself, right? And people are quitting because they do not have intrinsic value in their work, I feel. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, if they're leaving I think there's 2 groups. I think there's people who they lack that intrinsic tie, and that's why you see them leave that industry entirely. And these are, I think, also the people you ask them. Like I had a guy, I asked him, what do you like about your job? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, what do you like doing? And he goes, I don't know. It's a self-awareness piece.
That's a big deal. He needs. I
was going to say, I know your book, there's a section on self-awareness that maybe we need to come back to here in a sec.
Yeah, sure.
And then I think there's another group of people who they're quietly quitting because they like what they do. They like their industry. They just deeply dislike the culture of the business they're in. A bad manager, a bad boss. They don't feel like their work is recognized or valued, or in a very literal sense. When we talk about value, they're getting a 3% raise, which is less than inflation. And they're looking at, their buddy who just jumped ship to the other business down the street, who's getting, a 12% raise. So,
you know what I find most valuable, Blake?
What?
That quality time.
Yeah.
And I will never work another Friday for the rest of my life, period.
Yeah.
And most of my days, I might start at 5 or 6 in the morning because I get great joy about what I do. And young people keep me young, right? So I hire them and keep them around. But we do the day, and this is in the book, about managing your time, because if you're going to do a transformation, well, hey, it takes time, right?
Yeah.
What time in your day do you have for that? So I got up earlier and earlier, and as when I get up, I know what my day is going to be like. I plan it the day before, and I keep a logbook about every week, right, that I work on something, and it reminds me to go back to the things. If you've ever had that, right? Oh, right. I wanted to do that, right? And but the main thing is that I'm able to do it because of time management. And I've become like this person that's very, what do you call, really interested in, kind of fascinated with time management. They're great things, and they're all in the book about where you can find super books on time management and other topics. They're under over 140 sources and attributions that I used in making the book, because I didn't want it to be, some guy from Maryland, wrote about his experiences in life and, hey, this is what it is. It needed to have the touchstone of reality and, coming from a foundation of people that are credentialed and working, like Brene Brown and her book, Daring Greatly. And she talks about fear and shame. And I think that comes up with salespeople, right? And if you're going back to extrinsic and intrinsic, that if you're going to keep your salespeople, you've got to learn about what it is that they're motivated. My people, everybody who comes through this door knows it's quality time. And if they're ready to rock and roll, we're going to do it 17 minutes at a time. We change gears, 10-minute break, 4 units of 17, right? And we go throughout the day, and we are done by 3:30, 3:45, like when you were in high school, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know their motivation, and I pay them well. Certain things pay bonuses. And I feel like, and I think you might agree, that motivation can't happen without commitment, and commitment can't happen without knowing what your purpose is. What are you getting out of this? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And like thinking about your purpose, I want to go back to this chapter on self-awareness. I do think a lot of people, you ask that question, like, what is my purpose? What is your purpose? And I do think a lot of people are searching. A lot of people are trying to figure it out.
Indeed.
A lot of people, I think, don't even necessarily know their giftings or skill sets, because in many cases it's so normal to them. They don't realize, that it's actually that special. I really like this chapter on self-awareness. There was a study done by Harvard Business Review on the number of people who thought they were self-aware versus were actually self-aware.
Interesting.
And the people who were actually self-aware, and the way they did this was they asked these people to rate themselves from 1 to 5, and then they asked their coworkers to rate them from 1 to 5. Mm-hmm. And there was this interesting gap. There was a large number of people who rated themselves very highly, but their coworkers didn't rate them as highly. So these are people who thought they were self-aware, but really weren't. And then there was a small subsection where the data actually lined up. And these are people that HBR called actually self-aware. And it was only about 10% of the respondents were actually self-aware. And the older I get, the more I really feel like self-awareness is one of the key traits to really cling on to and master. Right. And like I mentioned, it's in your book. So clearly it's something that was, it hits your list of 33, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit about the book, if I may.
Yeah.
There are 3 chapters. The first is self-awareness. The second is philosophy, meaning, of course, self-awareness is self-evident, right? What that is about. There are 11 questions for each chapter. Philosophy deals with what's going on with your mindset, that term you used, you and I spoke earlier. Where, how are you coming at this? Are you ready? Put the book down. It's not time if you're not ready. That's one of the first questions in that section. But then saying, what's important to you, right? Where does your center? And how are you going to approach this? And, what is the meaning to you, right? We talk about comparison culture, which you brought up earlier. Right. And the right reason to move forward is not because that's what the guy does that has 3 homes across the country and $1 million income. Finding out what's most meaningful to you is your philosophy. And then lastly, the third chapter is action. And what is your action plan, right? How can you get this started? I talk about chewable chunks, meaning it's way too much to try to get in shape in a week because you pull every muscle in your body, right? So it's going to take time, but a chewable chunk will be, okay, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to work on that, and I'm going to find out how that goes, right? And I'm going to do that in this period of time. And it breaks it down into steps where you can take action and then implement your own strategy and move forward in that way. So those are the 3 chapters.
I love that. Well, as a reminder for our listeners, if you want to check out the book, it's at the33questions.com. That's the number 33, not the word. The33questions.com. The book's called Your Turning Point, 33 Questions for Transformation. Steve, Man, we're about out of time. This has been a great episode today. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the book or where you want to go from here?
Well, I want to thank you once again and kind of express that my intention in writing the book was to reach out to your audience and people that are considering where they are and what they'd like to accomplish. And I hope they find great value in what I have to offer.
Of course. Well, Steve, I appreciate you taking the time today. And of course, I wish you well. Again, I'll be sure to put the link to where people can buy the book down in the episode description below. So thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Blake.
Hey, for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, what the heck are you waiting on? Click that subscribe or follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. Don't forget, you can also support the podcast on our Patreon. It's at patreon.com/goodadvice. For as low as the price of a cup of coffee, you can keep the good advice rolling. And also don't forget, if you want to advertise on the podcast, you can reach out Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com. Do you need a business review for your business? Well, of course, you got to check out our website, goodadvicecoaching.com, to get a free business evaluation, getting you consistent customers and helping you do business better. All that to say, that's today's good advice. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you later. See ya.